Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for checking in wherever you are. My name is Ryan Naraine. I'm an editor at large here at SecurityWeek, covering a lot of the issues we're discussing here around vulnerability management, security alerts, and just the attack surface management space. Before we begin, just a quick bit of house cleaning. Today's session will run for about 45 minutes. We're hoping to have a really casual, organic conversation around the problems in this space. At the end of it, we'll save some time for some live Q&A at the end. So if you can drop your questions into the Q&A box in the interface there, we'll get to your questions at the end. I am obligated to notify you that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll send out the link afterwards in case you'd like to revisit or share it with your colleagues. Welcome to the Security Week webinar, Escape Vulnerability Overload, Stop Chasing CVEs, Validate Real Risks with our friends at Picus. I am excited today to introduce our speakers. Two fantastic speakers bring a lot of strategic and hands-on experience to this exposure validation space. I'll let the guys introduce themselves, starting with you, Hüseyin.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Hüseyin. I am from Picus Security. I am the security research lead, and I'm the expert on offensive security and threat intelligence space in Picus.
Thank you, Hüseyin. And Ali?
Hello, everyone. Ali Kapucu. I'm the lead solution architect here at Picus. And a little bit about my quick background is I've been in the cyberspace for close to 20 years. And I did the work in the large organization as a practitioner and then also consultant. So seeing the first hand of the issues that how we handle vulnerability management and exposure management there. So I'm really looking forward to have the insightful conversation here.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. So let's start the session. We're all familiar with software vulnerabilities and just the boatload of vulnerability reports that we've been either dealing with as a defender or reading it in the news. It's just been a bombardment nonstop of CVEs as new vulnerabilities get reported. Can you guys start with just like what you're seeing from Picus's side? How would you describe the state of this vulnerability exposure management space? What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I can take that. So that's a great question. So when you look at the vulnerability landscape that we are dealing today, and why the vulnerability management it's kind of it's not sustainable in the current state, right? So when we look at the numbers, as of May 1st this year, we already seen the 16,000 CVs disclosed, and think about that for a moment. That's roughly 133 vulnerabilities being discovered and published every single day. And this isn't even counting the more than 40,000 that we published in 2024 alone. So when we look at this, we are drowning. There's a lot of vulnerabilities and then it's keep rising and then keep coming up. So also, like when we look at this 16,000 new CVEs, that's 61% of them labeled as a high or critical. And that's on paper. That sounds terrifying. Like when we look at the numbers are just like everything's high, everything is critical. And from the perspective of the vulnerability management program, like we have to fix them right now. And when you look at your environment, how many of those critical vulnerabilities actually posing a real threat to your specific infrastructure, your configuration, your attack surface? But even that you could identify which vulnerabilities important, you still facing like a massive execution problem, right? The average organization takes 6,200 days to apply patches. That's obviously excluding vulnerabilities like RCE, we have to fix emerging threats. But that's 6,200 days. And then me as a person that dealt with the vulnerability management in the program before, it's just like a spreadsheet management. Like you have a spreadsheet, bunch of vulnerabilities, you just keep assigning people, and then you just keep adding more vulnerabilities to the people. And that's a 200 a day. So, and only 11% of the organization can actually patch critical vulnerabilities within 24 hours. So that requires a lot of maturity, a lot of agility within the organization. So, but even when we look at this is how this is like a firefighting game. Like this is how we end up called like firefighting and constantly chasing vulnerability scores, burning out our security teams, and then the problem is we're missing the vulnerabilities that actually matter. So our teams are tired. Our teams like keep getting it, and just like becoming like a new vulnerability, get into the list type of approach. So it's still not meaningfully reducing actual risk or risk exposure.
And so we have a prioritization problem in the industry, right? What you're saying is that there's alert fatigue. Every organization is dealing with numerous hundreds, sometimes thousands of vulnerabilities popping up in their vulnerability management tools, whatever tools they're using. And then we have a prioritization problem where you can't figure out which is the most urgent for me to address. And you mentioned scores, and you mentioned, I noticed on the slide here, you have the CISO KEV catalog, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. So we have in the industry a lot of scoring systems and a lot of attempts to help us do this prioritization. How do we prioritize the fix? And the question for you, Hüseyin, we mentioned CVSS and EPSS at the top. How do you view the way Picus looks at the whole scoring ecosystem and figure out this problem of this over prioritization?
We are all familiar with CVSS and EPSS. We always use CVSS to mention whether a vulnerability is critical or not. And whenever we receive a bunch of vulnerabilities, we sort them by CVSS. It's by default in the industry. Whenever we see a 10 out of 10 CVSS score, you prioritize that first. However, when we consider EPSS and CVSS, there is a vendor perspective to it. When CVSS
can I interrupt you here for a second on the CVSS side? You mentioned CVSS. It's something we're familiar with. Everyone knows this common vulnerability scoring system. Every vendor applies a CVSS score. Why is that on its own not enough? Why is that incomplete? What is the weak spot with just using CVSS? Like, why do we need additional scoring systems? What is the limitation that CVSS provides?
CVSS presents us the vendor's view to the vulnerability, and it considers the vulnerability in isolation, and it considers it to be accessible by itself. But however, we are not using these tools by themselves. We are connecting to them to other devices. We are using them in enlarged networks. So when CVSS is considered, it's considered for a single unit of that entire network. However, we are always using these things connected, and they are interacting with each other. We have security controls that defends those vulnerable assets. So CVSS scores means that it's vendor's perspective. However, your perspective is unique, and
Correct.
Your is unique. So 10 out of 10 vulnerability might not be exploitable on your end. Let me give you an example. When I was studying to be a pen tester, there was a famous vulnerability called EternalBlue. We all know. It was the Log4Shell before Log4Shell. And I was trying to create a payload for it, and it was not exploitable. I know that the machine was vulnerable. However, I could not get a remote terminal. When I tried different payloads, I saw that it was not exploitable in the way that I know. However, it was exploitable in another way. So if 10 out of 10 vulnerable CVSS score means it's vulnerable, it might not be exploitable in the way that adversary knows.
Right. And the argument is that if we use solely intrinsic characteristics and tools to flag high CVSS scores, they aren't realistically exploitable, like you just explained. So how should defenders view this? Are we looking to generate a new score altogether? Can you explain to me how you view exposure validation? Because that's the missing piece, right? How do you validate that your organization is actually exposed to this specific thing and it's actually exploitable? And I really need to pay attention to this. How do you guys view this?
I can take that. So the way that exposure validation is, it's in the vulnerability management program, is such a game changer option, right? So as Hüseyin mentioned, he mentioned fundamentally about answering one critical question. Is this vulnerability that I'm seeing is actually specifically actually exploitable in your environment? Not just whether it looks terrible or a scanner report says like this is a high score, scary score there. So I see that if I want to put like in an example, like a traditional vulnerability management. It's like you have some sickness, you go to Google and then you search about the symptoms, and then you were like, oh, you self-diagnose yourself, oh, I have this problem. It's like that, but without going into the doctor, having X-rays or like a proper examination without what's happening there. So that's like you look at the symptoms that this vulnerability is available. This is the version of the software, and then this is the CVSS score assigned with it. That's it. So we're not talking about the protected vitamins. We actually have that vulnerability, that issue, that sickness is available. So I mean, still, like, don't get me wrong, that traditional recordings, the prioritization models based on the CVSS, EPSS is asset tagging. They are still helpful tools, right? That the way that we leverage today. It's giving us a starting point. But their fundamental flow that they assume that every vulnerability is in a complete package. Software is there, vulnerability. They do not consider other stuff. So like this could be exploited or not. So can this actually exploited here? They don't answering this question. The question is, can this actually is bad for this environment? And with these defenses in place, like you've been, this is where exposure validation comes in and then changes everything. So we bring actually your security controls into equation, your EDR solutions, your intrusion prevention system, your SIM rules, your firewall configuration, your network segmentation, all these defenses layers that you invested in for years in the security program. You have $1 million of investment, and then you're just gonna just take that vulnerability and say, yeah, we have to fix it. But what happens to all these tools and technologies that you put in place? So what we do is that we run and save the control simulation that mirror real attack scenarios on the exposure validation. And we've been doing this since 2013. So we are pretty good at like looking into individual attack, individual understanding these specific techniques within the environment can actually give you a perspective of this is what's happening, and in reality, this is what's going to happen. So at this point is vulnerability is not becoming your biggest problems. Actually, your security controls are doing their job, so that vulnerability may not be relevant for your environment. So this approach is kind of fundamentally shift how we think about cybersecurity because it's not sustainable anymore. So we are moving from theoretical risk assessment to actually validating impact measurement, right? So instead of assuming every vulnerability in a crisis waiting to happen, we actually testing and providing which ones can hurt you, and pretty much stop assuming the risk and start measuring and understanding how that actually works.
I want to apologize for some of the audio issues we're having. I'm also having the same audio issues as well, with some audio breaking up. I apologize for it. It's coming in and out, and it seems to be getting better. So hopefully we can continue to move on. Hüseyin, I wanted to spend some time on this slide that we're seeing on the screen, this exposure validation. You're kind of defining it here. Like when can you provide some example scenarios of where this exposure validation helps a security program?
I'll explain that. We have vulnerabilities, however, we also have security controls that defend against those vulnerabilities and possible exploitations. So let me give you an example on how we should deprioritize some vulnerabilities using our security controls. As I said, we have CVSS scores. In this example, I gave that Log4Shell example. It was 10 out of 10. We all know that it was a hugely impactful vulnerability we found in late 2021. We all know that it was impactful. We had many of security controls and other assets had this vulnerability. When we looked at from the perspective of CVSS scores, we had to prioritize all the vulnerable assets, and we had to prioritize all the vulnerabilities, and we had to fix all of them. However, if you look at it as layer by layer, many of us use defense in-depth strategies, and we put our assets behind security controls. We see that not every asset is exploitable 10 out of 10. Because some devices live in perimeter, those are not very defended. However, some vulnerable assets, are very well deep in the network. So we have to factor in the security control effectiveness when we calculate the prioritization efforts. Without those, we had to prioritize all the vulnerable assets. However, if we take security control effectiveness into the equation, we can deprioritize certain assets and focus on the most vulnerable ones first. If we were to continue with the Log4Shell example, let me show you the next one. As we said, adversaries are able to identify assets on the perimeter first. For example, if we have a public-facing a VPN service that is vulnerable to a Log4Shell attack, it is 10 out of 10 because adversaries were able to access that asset first. However, an endpoint living behind network segmentation, behind firewalls, behind web application firewalls, are not that exploitable because attackers need to first bypass those security controls and access to the vulnerable asset and deploy their exploit codes so they can exploit it. As we deploy and configure our security controls better and better, we are much more defended against even against the 10 out of 10 vulnerabilities. So we need to validate first that those vulnerabilities are exploitable.
One of the things is that you've shown, it's clear here that this exposure validation approach can increase or decrease the priority score of a vulnerability. And I imagine this changes over time too, as context changes and new exploit code appears and proof of concept appears. You're doing this. I imagine it's like it's a continuous thing. But how can you be sure that security teams are not missing something critical when you're like maybe deprioritizing something? Is there like a fail-safe checkbox that you provide?
Actually, we gave an example on one vulnerability. However, in our environments, we have thousands of assets. And as Ali mentioned, there is over 100 vulnerabilities disclosed a day. And also we have zero-day vulnerabilities that we do not know about yet. So we are not testing against one vulnerability and one exploit code at a time. In exposure validation, we use breach attack simulation and automated pen testing solutions to run validation services continuously. With breach attack simulation, we have thousands of exploit code at our hands in our libraries. We run those exploit codes continuously back to back, so we can identify which vulnerabilities are exploitable. And we combine CVSS scores, exploitability scores, and assets accessibility, and we combine those to create an exposure score. We are not looking at one vulnerability. Yeah.
Define asset accessibility there for me. Like you're talking about scores, and asset accessibility is whether it's reachable.
Yeah. Because as I said, if an asset lives on the perimeter, it's much more accessible to the adversary. However, if it's well deep in the network and behind security controls, behind network segmentation, it's not very accessible to the adversary. We are in exposure validation. We have the adversary's perspective, so we use their tools. We use their exploitation codes, exploit codes, POCs, and we use their tactics to calculate those exposure scores and prioritize based on those.
One thing I want to add
Interesting.
here. I also saw one question on the chat, Ryan. So that's like one of the questions that I usually get from my customers. The question is one that needs to know how vulnerability can be exploited. If the control one has will effective against the vulnerability. So that's going back to the thing I mentioned. We're talking about assessment since 2013 that our company has been doing that. We have the vast of knowledge about the vulnerabilities and then how that vulnerabilities work with this environment and what type of environment they needed. So, for example, a vulnerability that leveraging PowerShell certain modules within the PowerShell script, right? So when we execute our simulations, we know what we can do from the PowerShell perspective within that environment, or living off the land bins. Like this is also available within our simulation library. So when we look at the vulnerability that leverages one of these techniques, and then it's solely relying on, for example, PowerShell specific module, and then we know through the simulation that is not actually runnable within your environment, your EDR is blocking that specific technique, then we will mark that vulnerability as a low score, right? Exactly how Hüseyin showed on the screen there. The certain technologies need a certain techniques to run within the environment. And then all our actions mapped to MITRE, all our actions are mapped to these TTPs. And then we have a little bit knowledge. We have the knowledge of these specific vulnerabilities, that how we can actually execute from the attacker perspective. And then we can actually give you a clear answer that is what's happening here.
What does that clear answer look like?
The clear answer look like is reducing the existing score, that as we give the score to each vulnerability, we will take the assessment of how much asset that you have within your environment, how many vulnerability you have within your environment, and what is that the impact that you receive from your simulations, attack path validation, and other environmental technologies that you have your environment, and then put into the scale.
Another question from the audience here is, are you able to provide context and evidence for each vulnerability or finding which gets reprioritized? It might be deprioritized, it might be even the priority might even increase in some cases. Are you able to provide any sort of context and evidence there?
Yes, we can. Because when we look at the vulnerabilities, we also tell you, here's the vulnerability, here's all the assets that are available within the environment, and here's the scan result, the simulation results that we take. Like, for example, we are doing command line injection, right? Command line scripting. If those tests has been run within the environment, we'll be able to tell you, yes, this vulnerability relies on this, and then based on the simulations you have, we are not protected by there because your EDR solutions are actually allowing those to be run within the platform. So that's how we can tell there's a specific vulnerability, and here's the results for that.
Right, that's why you call it evidence-based, right?
Exactly.
The other question here, another question here from George is, recognizing that each threat is unique, is there a basic cybersecurity measure you would recommend that would give an organization a lower exposure validation score for most threats, regardless of the CVSS score? So is there like a simple basic cybersecurity measure? Is there a control? Is there one single thing that can help you help you lower this exposure score?
Yeah, this is like again, the adversarial exposure validation, a combination of multiple products. That's like a new thing. It's combining vulnerability asset management, breach attack simulation, and then attack path validation. So as you go to run these simulations within your environment, which it will give you a contextual information about the specific vulnerabilities, it will actually tell you the specific like a general mitigation techniques. Like, for example, if we are looking into lateral movement activities, and it's solely relying on just a basic example about the TCP 445 between endpoint to endpoint, that will give you a feature like a recommendation about block 445 traffic between your endpoints. Leverage your Windows endpoint firewalls, or leverage your IP tables or things like that to block lateral movement activity between environments. So that's going to be one item that we recommend. The other item is we actually, when we execute these attacks, we're not just telling you, now I'm going into a little bit more like a security control validation, like a breach attack simulation. We actually tell you, here is the signature you need to enable in order to block this attack. Here is the detection query, detection engineering type of approach that you need to apply into your environment so you can alert yourself the next time this is happening. So we kind of give you those informations, and on top of that, the adversarial exposure vulnerability scoring.
Are you also embedding in your breach attack simulation platform? It's not only for known vulnerabilities, right? Like you have techniques to look for gaps and weaknesses and weak spots. I don't want to call them 0 days because that takes on a whole life of its own, that name.
When
but
you
in
start
effect,
yeah.
Say again?
When you say 0 day, that's a whole different new level things.
That's a different word, but for unknowns, you also have techniques to search for unknowns in the platform. We're not just relying on CVEs and existing known vulnerabilities, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I can answer that one. We have known threats like malware samples, ransomware samples, and we also have exploitation codes for example, for web application attacks. We also have endpoint attacks that can run endpoint attacks like lateral movement attacks, Linux-based attacks, and some ransomware payloads that is not harmful to your environments. For example, we do every step of ransomware attack, but at the end of it, we are just saying that we hacked it, but we did not encrypt it, and we can simulate different kind of threats in the threat library. For each simulated attack, we give different mitigation suggestions. Like Ali said, we give vendor-specific prevention signatures. We also give detection rules, so you can convert from Sigma to your environment or use it directly in your QRadar or something like that.
This is really, really fascinating to me because I know this alert fatigue is a real significant issue for CISOs and defenders, just inundated with vulnerabilities like you showed in your opening slide, right? And now we're getting to your breach attack simulation platform that does the attack live and provides context and gives you helps you reprioritize, deprioritize, and so on. Where does this go? And I want to ask a question because a lot of the audience here is being inundated with words around AI and AI automating things and AI doing all of this magic in the background. How are you guys viewing the use of AI and the use of automation to kind of simplify a lot of this for defenders who are clearly overwhelmed with all this stuff?
At the beginning of this year, we published a large report called Threat Report 2025. In that findings, we saw that adversaries are using AI. However, the AI cannot create a unique technique out of blue. At the moment, AI is scaling things up. It's creating a better automation for us, for defenders and for attackers. It is not creating a unique way to create an attack technique. However, it sharpens the tools that we already have. It can scale up an exploitability code. However, it's not at the moment trying to create a unique things. We can use AI for our advantage. For example, in our platform, we are gathering all the threat intel from open source platforms. Using AI, we create threat simulations out of them. So without going through thousands of threat intelligence reports, we feed that intelligence reports to AI so it can give us that, yeah, these are the threats that are targeting you. You should simulate these first. So it's from the defender's perspective, AI is helping on that front.
I want to add.
Who do you think has the upper hand?
As Hüseyin mentioned, scaling we are in the agentic era, that's what they call from the AI perspective, right? A lot of work. Let's say think about the vulnerability report that comes in, is talking about a dedicated vulnerability, and we have a disclosure from the researcher, and that usually goes into very technical details on the report. From the human perspective, not many people will actually read that whole report and then got into like every single detail on the assembly level 0 and 1s to gather that information, right? But from the AI perspective, we can totally leverage that, understand each technique, and then based on the data we have, we can ask AI to generate an action, generate a TTP that may leverage these techniques. And based on the database you have, which is our threat intel database, and then asset database, not asset database, but our TTP database, based on those, recommend us how we can actually mimic and execute this vulnerability within our environment without going into like a special program. I mean, you also seen a lot of like probably videos around, on Instagram or Twitter or other places or X about how people are actually doing zero code programming. So think about this, how we can apply these reports into our favor and then actually create actions, create the playbooks for ourselves to execute these attacks within the environment. So it's really the limits is out there. Like it depends on what we can do, how we can leverage it. And I'm super happy that our research team has been really busy with those ideas. And then I'm sure that's going to come like a really interesting outcome's going to come from there.
It's fascinating. I didn't want to bypass the conversation into AI, but I know the audience is listening to this, and that's what they're hearing from every vendor, that AI is fixing everything. So I wanted to just kind of get a real world perspective on how you guys view it. And then more importantly, we talked about this as exposure validation, making sure we're prioritizing the right things and scoring vulnerabilities in the right way. What is the end result for a Picus customer? Are you providing an exposure score? Is that a defendable thing? Can you talk a little bit about what, when all this deprioritization and reprioritization is done, what is the customer left with?
Sure. I think if we move to one slide. So what you're seeing here is our exposure score framework that, and I want you to notice something important. Every single component here is visible and adjustable. So when you look at the Picus score that we give you, there's no black box algorithm. It's not like you will take whatever Picus is telling you to, take it based on the environment. So that will give you the decision that you can control. So, and our exposure score combines the 5 key factors here. So each on its own weight and on the final calculation, right? Base CVSS provides that we already talked about, the foundational severity assessment by the vendor, and that's your starting point. It's up to you how much value that you want to keep there. And then after that point is the security control effectiveness come in, where we get into real world. So this is accounting how your existing defenses, your EDR, firewall, IPS, DLP, and other stuff is actually mitigate the specific threats.
Are you calculating this for them, or are they calculating this themselves, the security control effectiveness?
Security control effectiveness comes from us, but our customers can tweak it, right? Yeah, they can tweak that. And then,
but your breach, your simulation will tell them if the EDR missed something, or that's why you get to calculate it here first. Yes. But then they can tweak it on the back end based on their own internal context and their own internal knowledge about how things are, yes, connected or available or accessible and so on. Got it.
Yes. And then exploitability leverages like using EPSS data to understand the likelihood of that vulnerability will actually be exploitable. So yes, we do have all these TTPs that we all have a simulation that we can test, but there's also, when you look at the reports, there's an EPSS that actually also vendor gives, this is likely can happen or very unlikely, based on the efforts and then the data needed for that specific vulnerability to be triggered. So, and that's a real threat intelligence that comes from that, and we're not just looking into a theoretical possibility here. And then contextual.
This score comes from the vendor too, right? This EPSS score comes from the vendor as well.
Yes. But you
Right.
can
And
rate
does that take into consideration? Does that take into the consideration entry in the KEV catalog as well? Is that all included in this kind of exploitability within your framework? When you're looking at exploitability, are you looking to be whether it's exploited in the wild or it's exploited, it's already on the KEV list, would increase this score? Correct?
That's also coming from the intelligence perspective.
Got it.
Yeah. So on the contextual CVSS, that where your environmental factors, your infrastructure, network accessibility, and then the privilege requirement, user requirements, things like that. And then I think the most important piece here is the business critical, the ensuring that you're not just thinking technically. We always talk about technical applications so far. We're not just thinking from technical perspective, but thinking from the strategically. A vulnerability, for example, on your payment processing system carries different weight than on the development lot, right? So that's going to be the data that we receive from your environmental system asset database or your CMDB or SQL database. However you want to deliver that data, we'll actually take that business criticality score, and then you can do higher weight, like a payment processing system. If you say this is 100% important for me, that will gonna override pretty much everything, right? So that's the business criticality is the most important piece that we receive from our customers to handle it.
A quick question from Stuart here. Do any of these variables in this exposure score introduce input from the site internet accessibility? I'm not sure I quite follow. Does it mean whether whether the vulnerability is reachable from the internet, whether something is exposed to the internet?
It is called.
Go ahead, Hüseyin.
In the contextual CVSS and the security control effectiveness, you consider those also, because if an asset sits on the internet-facing side of the network, it's much more exploitable. So I don't need to bypass another security control to reach it. Right. So in this calculation, we also consider that internet accessibility is baked into the exposure score, because the exposure score uses different elements of the Picus platform. First, we use our attack surface validation. So we consider the attack surface and calculate how many steps we need to take to reach that asset. Also, we use breach attack simulation and also use automated pen testing tool to validate the security control effectiveness and exploitability stuff. So we also consider whether it is on the internet-facing side or well deep into the network.
I want to ask a real-world question because I'm writing about this almost weekly. On a weekly basis, there's a new Ivanti zero-day. Let me give you an example. Ivanti zero-day and exploited in the wild. There's a KEV catalog. Ivanti confirms in their bulletin that this thing, we have information that this has been exploited in the wild. However, when I look through some of those bulletins, I see Ivanti saying, well, if the customer had set this up properly, or if our mitigation guidance or installation guidance were properly done, this would not have been exposed on the internet. That is something that your breach attack simulation platform can determine for an end user customer to say, okay, this might be a big Ivanti thing. We use Ivanti everywhere. It's at CVSS 10.0 on the KEV list, but I know I've configured it differently and I have my mitigations in place. This means that your exploitability score will automatically be lower than if these things were not in place. Sorry if it's a convoluted question, but
no, actually, we provide proof that it's not exploitable because we actually use the exploitation techniques used by the adversaries to verify that it is exploitable or not. So if you use that guidance and that guidance, if that guidance works, you are good because it's the exploitation code would not be working. But even if you apply the guidance 100% and still exploitable, you cannot blame others. You should verify that it's whether it is exploitable or not. So I think that's why we are saying that you should go beyond CVSS, you should go beyond vendor suggestions. You should go out there and see that it's exploitable or not. Otherwise, you will be left with a vulnerable asset and think that I did everything great, but I still breached. So we don't want that.
We got 5 more minutes, and I got a couple of questions coming in. George is asking, interesting question, from a liability perspective, if an organization determines that a threat with a high CVSS score should be deprioritized because of Picus, and then they end up being attacked or breached through that same vulnerability, how do I figure out my liability issue there?
That's a great question, because we are wired to prioritize high CVSS scores first. However, with that approach, we say that I tested and said that it is not exploitable because, for example, let's go with the Log4Shell example again. I used the LDAP query to exploit the vulnerable asset for Log4Shell, and I saw that my web application firewall blocks it. So I'm not vulnerable to that attack. So I run different versions of that Log4Shell vulnerable exploitation. So I can see that I'm not vulnerable to those techniques either. So I'm not vulnerable to known threats, known techniques. So I can deprioritize it first, because there is a bunch of vulnerability lists we need to address first. So it is not eliminated from the list, but deprioritize. I can take care of something much urgent first, so I can take care of something that is blocked by firewall or EPSS, IPS.
How do you respond to, I'm going to put on my journalism hat here and say, oh my gosh, you're just giving me another score. You're putting another number in front of me. And now I have EPSS, CVSS. Now I got to deal with an exposure score. How do you defend the importance? Just to sum it up all again, why is this the most crucial thing for an organization to pay attention to? And why should I, build my organization to absorb a new exposure score?
Because it's easier to deal with. It's evidence-based, because I show, for example, if an auditor comes to my place and says that you deprioritize based on Picus but not CVSS, why did you do that? I can show the proof that the deprioritized vulnerability was not exploitable because I was defending with my security controls, and show that Picus was able to exploit another low CVSS scored vulnerability and gain domain admin access. So do you want me to prioritize a not exploitable vulnerability, or do you want me to block at domain admin access? So that's why we are showing that it's a big order to do, it is a big thing to do to replace CVSS. CVSS will be there for a long time. However, we are saying that we are looking from your perspective, not from the vendor's perspective. You should focus on exploitability first and defend your organization based on exploitability, based on evidence.
Got it. And if you go back to the original opening slide that discusses the problem statement of inundation, alert fatigue, and so on, then you realize that your exposure score actually does whittle it down and give you at least something a lot more actionable than 16,000 CVEs or 5,000 things here and there. You get something a lot more actionable. Any closing thoughts? Ali first, and then Hüseyin, I'll give you the last word.
Well, closing thoughts, I also see one question that I want to quickly add there, and that could be part of my closing thought. The known techniques that Picus is aware at that point in time, things change all the time, and some even inadvert. I still think this is a good tool. Well, thank you very much for that, first of all. The threat library that we have a team of the Picus labs that is behind our threat library. It's actually adding new threats, new techniques to our library every day, and sometimes multiple times a day. So that is actually showing the fact that we are on top of the new techniques. And then I would love to have the further conversation with Idrissa, if that's possible, to show how we can actually go into a level that our library is actually complementing your vulnerability program. Again, at the end of the day, it's a I know a lot of organizations, and not only like a very minimal of organization like going beyond the spreadsheet. That's a special thing. I've been there. We've been there. We've been doing it for years, and then it's still. When you look at organization, it's still actually spreadsheet is the best way to handle vulnerability management so far. And that's what we're trying to go from beyond. Like instead of giving them the 100 vulnerability, let's give them 20 vulnerability for this week because that's most important for you, and this is most important for your environment. And then let's validate our vulnerabilities based on the test simulations that we have, and then go beyond our standard CVSS and EPSS scores.
Sorry, Ali, I think we lost your closing, the last couple of sentences there. Hüseyin, I'll let you do the last words or closing slide.
With exposure validation, we are trying to help you to identify the vulnerabilities that would sink your ship. Because we are managing large organizations, we are managing thousands of assets. Vulnerabilities are inevitable. However, some vulnerabilities are more impactful for your environment. Vendors cannot know that. You know that. You should be able to identify those. With exposure validation, you will know that which vulnerability is more impactful for my environment, for my organization, and so I can prioritize them first. By going with the exposure validation route, you will see that more impactful vulnerabilities are not the thousands of vulnerabilities disclosed by the vendors. You will shorten your vulnerability list very much, and it will show you that the 10 vulnerabilities, 20 vulnerabilities are going to impact you more than the others, and you should focus on them first. After that, you can deal with the rest. However, these 10 will help you much better in your defense against the evolving cyber threats.
Thank you, Hüseyin. Thank you, Ali. Thank you to Picus Security for this really, really informative webinar. I will go do a lot of research into this exposure score now just to try to understand how this is really addressing that problem statement. Thank you guys very much for participating. And to the audience, thank you very much for the great questions. Thank you for helping keep this conversation going.